So I'm really excited to introduce Catherine Harrell from the University of Washington, who's going to give kind of a higher level overview of what's happening here. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Hello. You guys hear me? All right. Yes. Louder. How about that? How about now?
Clip it a little higher.
No. It's on my jacket. I can put a shirt here. How's that? Better? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk to you guys about Puppet from a kind of conceptual, visual perspective. So we've seen a couple of talks that are going into some technical depth and explaining how to use the tool and a couple of different techniques. And I'm going to take it from a slightly different angle because I'm actually not a sysadmin, not a developer. I am a UX designer. And so I am one of the people that you may work with if you're building applications or if you're creating something new in a company. You have probably noticed that not everyone you work with does the exact same thing that you do. You may have to interact with product managers, designers like myself, maybe senior leadership. And so I'm going to hit it from that angle because a lot of the problems you may face with trying to implement a tool like Puppet may actually be cultural and maybe with the people you interact with. So trying to bridge that communication gap a bit. So a little bit about what UX design is. I live here in Seattle, and as Kara mentioned, I teach a course at the University of Washington. It's an interaction design course for students who want to become designers. So that means I do a lot of slides that kind of look like this, describing, here are the different components of an application, the navigation bars, the menus, the buttons, the controls, all of these kind of front-end pieces of what you guys would implement on the back end, or what developers would implement on the back end, and system administrators keep running all day long. And so I teach designers to think about problems kind of from start to finish as a story, going through storyboards and walking through the process that an end user would take. And we tend to analyze designs from a single screen perspective, between screens, sometimes the whole entire experience. And why I think this is kind of relevant to you guys is that at the end of the day, what you're trying to create and run as smoothly as possible is usually, in one way or another, for the purpose of some kind of end user experience that's optimal. I spent some time at Amazon Web Services designing interfaces for a whole variety of tools for them, and that was where I first learned about the world of cloud computing and what all goes on there. I remember working on a project, and the developers were in one room, and the kind of managers, designers, product people were in the other room. And this was before it launched, so it was, the code was a little bit shaky and things would crash occasionally. And at one point, one of the managers says, well, why is our server down? What's going on? Why can't I get to the site? And so he calls in one of the devs who's explaining, well, we're running the Chaos Monkey tool and it just shut down a couple of our servers. And our manager goes, what? I don't know what that is. What are you talking about? And so poor dev is trying to explain, well, it's this tool and it was popularized by Netflix and it lets you, resilience test your systems. And so our manager makes a request, which sounds kind of reasonable, right? He goes, well, can we at least time this so we know when it's coming and be prepared for it and not have it go down when I need to use the site? He says, well, no, it's gotta be a surprise. We have to be prepared anytime. And just seeing this communication gap that was happening made me think, well, two things. One, I don't know what's going on in that room, but it sounds kind of awesome. And secondly, that it's interesting that we're all trying to build these applications together, and yet we don't always speak the same language. And it turns out that this type of communication gap is not that uncommon. I was preparing for this talk by browsing Reddit, as one does. And this post is kind of funny, because how can I tell if my system administrator is actually working or just slacking off? And this person, who is, I think, has more of a business background, doesn't know much about IT, and goes on at some length about, at first, I could tell he was doing things and he's typing away in his command line, but you know, I don't do IT, and I really couldn't tell you what he's doing now. And hey, I set up a WordPress blog over the weekend. It wasn't that hard, so I don't know what it is about his job that's so difficult. So he goes on at some length, and as you may expect, gets a little bit of snark from the Reddit community. Give him a 2-week cruise vacation. You'll find out really quickly what he does. And problem with computers, IT guy isn't doing anything. Nothing wrong with computers, IT guy isn't doing anything. And well, you're definitely a manager. Right? There's some throwing across the fence both ways. And then this kind of interesting little one that came up, which is, you know, your real problem is trust. You should consider why you don't trust your IT person and work on that. And well, first of all, I love that this person came to Reddit with his grievance. It's like, Reddit, you know, where you people hang out? I come in peace and please help me, you know. And I wanted to talk a bit about, you know, you've all heard of this DevOps movement and these new tools coming in and new ways of working. And it's interesting that, you know, when you read about some of these movements that are going on and these changes people are making, a lot of times the problems are humans, they're people. And this is an interesting quote from an article. It says, you know, technology is rarely cited as a problem in these surveys people go through. It's the technology's there, right? People are kind of ready to use it. They want to experiment, give it a try, but there's people blocking progress. It's not changing fast enough. There's sometimes resistance, not always on purpose, right? But organizations, especially of people who are different from each other, they tend to kind of intrinsically hang on to the status quo a little bit. This frustration may be familiar to you all. And so it almost doesn't matter how great the tool is if you can't communicate about it. So that's the motivation of this talk, and it's kind of in the spirit of a previous Puppet Camp discussion, which you guys should check out if you haven't seen it. It's selling Puppet to managers and developers. For today, I'll assume that your developers are all sold. That's kind of out of scope for me. But I'll talk a bit about the management side of things. So let's talk about how Puppet fits into your work at a high level, kind of an overall explanation of how this might work. So we're here in Seattle. We love coffee, right? So let's imagine you want to build a simple web app. That's what you've been tasked with doing, to sell coffee. And as you know, there's a lot of components that make this web app work, okay? And you know, you've got to have a server at the very most basic level, a server, some kind of database to store things. You've got your various platforms and libraries. You might have monitoring, networking, things to keep it secure. All these pieces and components, which you're very intimately familiar with. At a basic level, it's piping. You may have some feedback, right, that explains what's going on in the app that you respond to. In other words, these are kind of what keeps your app running. And so the advantage that you would see for Puppet, you can know your environment. You can say, I know what all the pipes are. I know what all the pieces are. I know what they look like. I know how they're supposed to be. And secondly, you can maintain that desired state. So if something changes, you change back. And you can replicate these environments. That's something that may not strike your non-technical stakeholders as important, or they may not know why that matters. But you know, as you're spinning up multiple environments, or you're testing things, making sure they work before you put them out to customers, and you want to do that quickly, that's something that kind of resonates. And each of these pieces is a potential point of failure, or it's a potential something that could change, go wrong, kind of fill up the works or clog things up. And with an app like Puppet, you can make sure that everything is running as it should be and have that kind of peace of mind. So there's a nice video too that shows some of the benefits of Puppet Enterprise in some depth, and it actually uses like a sort of paper prototype kind of thing, which is a tool that designers use too, actually. They take little slips of paper and they move them around and show what's going on. So you should check that out as well. I'll put up these slides and you can see that at the end. As you guys know, you're not always tasked with just building a simple web app, right? What makes our jobs complicated is that you're not just building the app that sells coffee, you're kind of in charge of the entire coffee shop, which is more than just that one little piece. You know, at your level, you have to think about something for the inventory, something about tracking customers, having some email systems for everyone to communicate with each other, what's coming in and out, there's a point of sale, there's all these different pieces and components. And in today's world, these tend to be digital at some level. You have inventories, spreadsheets, complex web apps, and it's your job to make sure these are all playing together and working together in harmony. And that's something that you're responsible for, which means that the piping, the plumbing that we looked at, which you could kind of explain in a very simple level and say, well, you know, it just kind of makes the information flow through your app. It's very easy to understand. That piping gets a lot more complicated all of a sudden. And that creates this whole set of emergent issues that come out, right? Now, in theory, you know, the benefits of using automation, using better practices, those benefits also get magnified at this level. Because, you know, if all of these potential failure points can be controlled, that's way better now. But it's not that easy. Partly because of the technical issues of trying to manage all these parts, but also because, you know, each of these pieces may be tied to a different group of people. And there may be different sets of documentation and so forth, and new stakeholders to convince. It becomes kind of a hairball. And so something that people have kind of had this feeling of, God, you know, I wish I could just scrap this whole thing and start from scratch. Because if I were to build our whole corporate infrastructure all over again, I would not do it this way. You know, I don't know why they put that there, and I wish they hadn't done this, and now I can't go back since it's dependent on this other thing. Wouldn't it be great if I could just like scrap the whole thing? Well, there actually is a fancy term for this idea of what if we could just start over, or at least sort of back burner the difficult stuff and use our new tools, use what we know now to start again with the brand new ones. And this is this phrase, bimodal IT, which you guys might have heard about. This came out of Gartner analysis. So to elaborate on it a little bit, we're in this era where these big IT organizations are kind of splitting in two, hence the kind of bimodal idea. You've got these traditional operations, which have to stay running, they've got to work, and they were built, you know, before some of these brand new tools and thought processes came about. And then this other side is what's charged with, hey, you know, kind of forget that stuff and go explore, make new applications, do things with the new wisdom that you have from all these years of creating things in the ways that make you pull your hair out a little bit. And so a lot of these next generation applications and services have a little bit more leeway, and it depends on the organization, it depends on the culture and how risk averse people are. But in a lot of cases, people are finding that, hey, they can actually try exploring a little bit with some of the greenfield apps. The trick is to identify, you know, which side you're on at a given time, and when you can actually take the reins a bit. And this is an interesting concept because it's coming from sort of two motivations. And one is that digital demands are higher than ever before. You know, you guys have to do more with less, is the way people describe it. And there's this understanding that's emerging that traditional IT can't quite keep up. And so we need to sort of unshackle IT a little bit and let them run. Just in order to just keep up. And the other kind of flip side of it is that it's an acknowledgement that the amount of resistance to fixing and changing and retrofitting the old systems is so profound that it's actually easier just to say, we're not really going to try to modernize everything. We're just going to pick our battles and focus on the new things, implement new practices from scratch. And the tools that we have and some of the new ways of thinking are sort of the best bet for doing that. And so when we combine something like Puppet or automation tools with other techniques, you know, frequent postmortems, resilience testing, you know, game days, containers, microservices, all these different sort of new terms that are flying around, you can get some pretty profound results. And fairly quickly, if you're not having to convince everyone along the way, this is what we need to do, this is what needs to happen. So a lot of folks had a similar paradigm shift when they, you know, spun up an EC2 instance and thought, oh wow, that's a lot easier than what we were doing before. That took very little time. And so if you read some of the Puppet case studies, for example, there's this, oh, that didn't take long. I kind of set this up and I automated this very simple process and immediately saw some results. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, it's one of the weapons you can use when trying to convince people that, hey, we want to start using some new tools, using some new ideas. Being able to demonstrate a little bit of success is a great way to do that. if you want to know more about this bimodal IT concept, it's kind of an interesting high-level look. Gartner does a lot of analysis of just the state of the industry, and this is one thing they came up with.
Sorry to interrupt, but the Providence team I was talking to earlier here are exactly in that situation. Like, they literally were split off from the IT organization and are working on a focus team to do DevOps tools.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's not so uncommon anymore. Absolutely. So let's talk about your stakeholder ecosystem. Let's get a little concrete here. Who am I talking about? I'm going to focus on sort of two primary players in the field, and one of them is upper management and the gatekeepers. You may be in a position where you need approvals for certain things. If you want to spend money, or you want to get a new tool or roll out a new process. This is also sort of culturally dependent. If you don't have one of these people, like, great, you want to take a nap. That's good for you. But for those of you who do need to get approval and make a case, that can take some doing. In a way, you're lucky because for the most part, unless your CIO or leader is asleep at the wheel, they've heard about some of these things, and they understand that, hey, there's a lot of new technology coming out. We want to get a piece of it, and so your job is to chart a path for them, not so much say, hey, let's do something different. And again, you'll have to assess how much convincing actually needs to happen there. But yeah, what they may not know yet is exactly how it could work for your organization. So if you can find a way to ease into doing new things, that tends to be your best bet. Do you guys remember Finding Nemo? There's like a scene where Nemo and his dad are trying to leave the reef, or the little anemone, and Nemo's ready to like charge out into the open ocean, and his dad's like, wait, no, we gotta stay here, and then we'll go out a little bit, and we'll come back in. That's sometimes how the senior leadership developer sysadmin relationship is. You want to go out and try new things, you want to test out new products and better ways of doing things, and they're kind of pulling you back in. It's like, it's not safe. And so organizations tend to be a little bit risk averse in some ways. It's not always one person who's to blame, but you've experienced this before. And so your job really is to make them feel safe out there in the open ocean, and to show that if we take a few steps, nothing disastrous happens, maybe we can take a few more. So if you think about your own responsibilities for a moment, you may be in a position where you can create new apps, or you may be in a position where you're tasked with maintaining existing legacy infrastructure, in which case, sorry. Or you may be charged with providing the applications in the cloud, the email, remote desktops, file storage. And your particular sphere of influence will help you decide what strategies you want to use to drive adoption of, say, Puppet in your own company. So again, we'll start simple. You want to make your case with some data, and think low risk, high impact when you're trying to choose an experiment or choose a way to make some progress. And again, going to this sort of simple web app idea, let's talk about some of the metrics or some of the evidence that you might try to pull into your camp here. So there's a technique that we use in the design world and front-end development world, I'm sure you guys do the same, this A/B testing idea, which is if we have two different options and we take a different approach to A and a different approach to B, and we can measure which one's better, that'll help us choose a path. Okay. So if you were to take an approach like this and say, here's the old way of doing things, here's a new experiment, what are some of the metrics that might be worthwhile? Well, one of them is environment creation. So in the sort of traditional workflow, each piece of that piping that I showed you, you have to create yourself. You have to configure and decide exactly what it looks like, and go ahead and set it up. So, getting the servers just right and getting the databases started. Whereas, with Puppet, in theory, you spell out how it should be, and you can create new environments much faster from there. You kind of set it and forget it. You decide how it should look, and you create new ones. And if you can measure this, and measure the time that it takes to create new environments, that can help you make a pretty compelling case to say, well, we need to do this X number of times, and we shave this much time off. That's helpful for us. The other metric is response time. It's when something goes wrong. How long does it take to get things back up and running? And so oftentimes, in the initial case, it's, well, let's check and see what's wrong. Sometimes you're able to triangulate pretty quickly on what the problem is and fix it. Or you may end up doing a bit of checking each part kind of one at a time and saying, well, could it be this? Could it be that? And finally, you'll stumble upon the issue and get things back online. But how long does that take you on average? And could you quantify it? And the nice kind of aspect of having something like Puppet running is that if you are doing, every 30 minutes, it's checking your system and making sure things are correct, it'll be kind of doing all these checks by itself and fix problems pretty quickly, sometimes before they even really become problems. Somebody switches something off or changes something, well, it'll pulse every half hour and try to fix something for you, or at least flag and alert you as to what's going on. The other is uptime, and this is a kind of the holy grail if you want these apps to be available all the time. These days, having apps go down, having downtime is not so acceptable. And if you can make sure to demonstrate, look, we have downtime on these various systems and we can improve it, that can be a very compelling thing. So if, again, if system 1 goes down, Puppet may self-correct pretty quickly if something goes wrong, and whereas the traditional way may have taken some more time to get things back online. And if you can decide, well, here's our percentage of uptime, here's how often things are rolling smoothly and as we expect, that's a good one to have. And frequency of deployment. This is not directly related to automation, but you'll find it may be a side effect if you're changing some of your practices. And the old way of thinking is, you push through these very heavy deployments through your system and lots of changes, and sometimes all those changes you push through will actually take the system down. Sometimes they won't, but you'll get a handful of deployments, and they're pretty few and far between. I know you'll have to push another correction in to fix things, right? If you have something that's automated, you've got an environment that's perfectly configured to sort of work each time, you can start batching, into smaller change sets and deploying a lot more frequently. So you can just kind of keep things rolling. If you can get, 3, 4, 5 deployments going to every 1 or 2 on the other side, that's an interesting metric. And to be able to explain that now, if you have a new feature that you want or a new update that you're interested in, the time from having that idea and getting it onto the screen is quicker. You can get more rapid deployments each day. And sometimes this is like orders of magnitude. People sort of slice up their workloads and end up with way more deployments than they used to, which is a pretty profound shift in how things are done, and can be kind of exciting to see. Especially if you can boast a high success rate. Say that we're not breaking things, we're actually getting updates out there into the world. Kind of the essence of this and what would resonate with most of your business stakeholders is how quickly can your organization go from having an idea and then generating value for the customer from that idea. And all those sort of steps in the middle that I was showing you, can we streamline those? Can we get rid of them? Can we sort of smooth them out? So these 5 metrics are basically ways of explaining that and trying to make that case. And if you aren't quantifying these today, you may have this problem of people don't know what they're doing and they don't know how to quantify what you're contributing. So it's worth to go back and see if we're not taking metrics on these already, could we start to? A few more potential ones. Not all of these are super quantitative, but having performance of your application, time to market or release cycle time if you can get it. Onboarding time actually may sometimes be something that you'll notice. So if you have your whole Puppet manifest, someone could sit down and read and say, here's the infrastructure, here's what it looks like, here are the pieces. So it's a little bit easier than having someone stumble through the dark until they figure out everything that's going on. And how quickly can they be productive? The size of change sets, like I mentioned, if you're sort of slicing up your deployments into smaller bits, being able to quantify that and say, here are the size of the change sets, we're actually making them smaller, making them leaner, that's making this more successful. You may or may not be able to tie what you're doing directly to the bottom line, like operational expenses. If you can, that's great. And some morale, collaborative spirit you may find helps a little bit. If part of the philosophy, I guess you could say, behind what Puppet and some automation software is trying to do is to try to get rid of some of the more monotonous parts of your job and like, I'm gonna change this thing, I do this 100 times a day, and kind of try to get rid of some of those, which can actually boost people's spirits a bit. And there have been a couple examples of companies who did surveys or checked out how people were feeling. So for some of these, you got to know your audience. What do you have to prove versus what's a given. And it's tempting oftentimes to try to get very, very precise metrics and get your data exactly right and kind of obsess over that. But it's important to know, remember we talked about this bimodal IT concept, this split is so profound and the results are so different that sometimes if you know that it's telling the right story, you can not necessarily have the most precise data, and you can explain that and say, well, these are approximate, or here's roughly what we're seeing. And if it tells a compelling story, that's sometimes enough, particularly if the person you're talking to already knows, he's already on your side with certain areas. Like, we know this is broken, or we know this is something we want to change. So again, it's know your audience. And if you're working with senior leadership, they tend to be business people. They want enough data to make a decision so they can move forward. If you're not confident in the precision of your data, but you're confident in the overall story, you can say so. And in fact, sometimes telling a story works just as well as collecting a lot of numbers. For example, it can begin with where you are. You probably already use automation at some level to make your job easier, right? Something that has to be done on a regular basis, you're going to try to automate it. You're going to write, cron jobs or kickstart files, or automate your process with scripts. Can you, in some way, quantify the benefits you're already getting from doing those things and then try to extrapolate? Well, that's an interesting story you could tell. Or to talk about what other companies do. So, a few of the companies using Puppet, like Barnes & Noble, Apple, Google, NASA, Bank of America, GE, you kind of take your pick. Try to find one that has some similarities with what you're doing, and try to draw those comparisons. For example, Google and Cloudera, I think, took the approach of starting to use Puppet with very simple tasks. So they automated their SSH keys first, and I think their NTP or their clocks or something, and they said, well, that really worked. That got us some benefits, what next? And so taking a company or a case study that's similar in some ways and saying, this is what they did. We could follow a similar path, maybe get similar results. That's not data, that's a story, but it can sometimes do the trick. There's a talk somewhere of someone who used Puppet with AWS CloudFormation, and he prescribed his whole infrastructure, like security and everything. It's a fun case, and there's a whole bunch of these. Everyone kind of does things a little bit differently. Let's see. So I'll post, there's a State of DevOps report, has some of those metrics and stats that you can use. And there's some case studies as well to kind of pull from. So the next person to talk about are the business unit owners. And I guess by that I mean the person with the idea, or the person who wants to create something that you're responsible for. These may be project managers, they may be designers, they may be sort of business leaders of some other kind, but they're basically the person that you want to make happy. So in this case, you may not need their permission to choose specific tools. You may not have to make a case, you may not have to say, look, please give me the money to do this or that. But you do need to keep them in the loop. They're kind of your stakeholder or your partner. And in this case, it's more about communicating than convincing. So the folks who were napping earlier because they don't have a CIO or anybody like wake up, this applies to everyone. And actually, kind of as I'll reinforce a little bit later on, these folks are your keys to the kingdom. If you can make them happy, they're kind of your customers, right? If you can make them happy, that will pay off for you. So one way to think about these folks is the kind of relationship you'd have with a doctor and a patient, in which you're the doctor and they're the patient. You want to explain what's broken, what's working, how are things going. And there's nothing more unnerving than having a doctor not explain what's going on, or to explain in way too much detail. And so try to think of it at that kind of level and say, okay, how can you reassure them that if something's wrong, you know how to fix it, or if something is going sideways, that you have a plan. Sorry guys, I got a bit of a cold, so I'm gonna keep drinking. This is tea, by the way. One of the other sort of insights from the bimodal IT and DevOps discussion was that these leading edge projects tend to have very tight integration with these business unit leaders, these people who have the ideas. They're saying, I want to build this application that does X, Y, Z, and they partner and communicate really closely with their DevOps folks or their sysadmins or developers. So again, back to this simple web app, you need to communicate your plan, you need to answer their questions promptly, and reassure them that, if this, then that. If this happens, then we're covered for the following reasons. And this is, again, something you'll have to play by ear a little bit, because Some people care more than others about this stuff. You'll occasionally get someone, and I've worked with a few, who, product managers who are a little hands-off, or designers who say, I don't care how it works, just make it work. And then there's some who really do want to know, and they really would love to hear exactly what's going on under the hood. And oftentimes a good leader will want to know the rough structure of the application at least, right? They'll want to understand, are things healthy and running? They'll want to know promptly about any failures. They'll want to know a set of key metrics about availability and performance. Not all of them, right? But some key metrics. What kind of scenarios are you prepared for? How quickly could a new feature be released? What's the scaling plan? What happens if this app encounters outrageous success? Or within an internal application, what happens if a lot of people start using it? They want to know about backups and failovers sometimes. So gauge the interest of the person you're working with and make sure that you're able to communicate those things. So before we talked about the different kind of components of the system, these are sort of the nouns, the things, servers, databases. One way to kind of flip it around a little bit when interacting with these stakeholders and communicating with them is in terms of verbs. So the things that you guys need to do for them, right? And so your job is to design and create this environment, actually decide what it's going to look like, to update it and kind of maintain it, so each piece gets updated periodically, fix problems when things go down, bring them back online, and deploy code, send in updates, update features, and copy things and create new test environments. Those are the verbs. Those are the actions that you're taking. And in many ways, those can be more concrete for non-technical stakeholders who don't necessarily know the ins and outs of servers and tools and so forth. As a system administrator, your job is to know a huge number of tools, like a ridiculous number of tools. I'm actually overwhelmed often by all that you guys have to know. Your non-technical audience is more interested in the broad categories, or what are you doing with those tools to help them out? In fact, I want to talk a little bit about the different levels of communication, right? And trying to gauge where your business owner is most comfortable. There's sort of this very high-level way of talking and thinking, just these sort of strategies, their big ideas, their courses of action, and then it kind of works its way on down to more conceptual, getting into examples and stories, and then all the way down to the details of what's the technical design, what scripts are we going to write, what metrics are we going to collect, sort of nitty-gritty of how things are going to be. There's, of course, levels even further down, like command line and code, going to the actual code, and this is probably the comfort zone for a lot of you. It's kind of a danger zone for your non-technical stakeholders. Not necessarily because they don't understand it. Again, a lot of good leaders, they do understand roughly what's going on, and it's kind of their job to make sure you do too, and to kind of drill you on certain areas and ask deep questions. But a lot of times the decisions and the conversations about what are we doing next happens higher up here. I remember doing some feature demos with some teams, and the dev manager would always tell the developers, if you guys pull up that terminal window or command line when you're pitching to our GM, you've already lost. Not because he doesn't get it, hey, this guy knows how to code a little bit, but because the conversation's happening somewhere else. You gotta make sure you can stay there. And you'll find that a lot of leaders and business people who are, can move very fluidly between the levels. But what I see a lot of times is, we're having a conversation up here, and someone sort of drills you a little bit and says, well, tell me more about that. The tendency is to dive all the way down here, or sort of swoop down a couple levels to the comfort zone. When really it's a better approach, I think, a lot of times is they're up here and they ask you for clarification, go down one level to tell a story or give an example and describe something in rough outline. And if they're still pushing, go another level down. That tends to work a little better. And hey, someone who's a good partner is going to meet you halfway. I mean, they're not just going to be up here in strategic land and not want to talk nuts and bolts with you at all. This is interesting little bit from a designer at BMW. And by the way, designers have similar communication gaps, not just with developers, but with our business stakeholders as well. And this one's about the design department at BMW having these issues trying to talk to finance, the finance department. They always want to build these new beautiful things. Finance is always saying no, and they kind of butt heads a little bit. And some of the tips that he gives are, when people misunderstand each other, and he describes them as gears. Like we want to be all sort of turning in opposite directions, but in unison and working together. And the way that when these gears get mashed, techniques he uses are tell stories, use metaphors. He says communication is the grease that keeps people kind of working, it keeps the gears running smoothly. Yeah, so here's an interesting little diagram. This is a slide, a PowerPoint slide about the war in Afghanistan. This was making the rounds on the internet a while back. This diagram earned a lot of ridicule. Again, some quotes here. Even the sharpest military minds in America were baffled by this slide. This is described as a mind-boggling attempt to explain the situation in Afghanistan. This is actually a general who said this. When we understand this slide, we'll have won the war. Right? PowerPoint has become public enemy number one. Okay. And this is sort of a jokey comment someone left. He doesn't have one of those optical illusion pictures. I think I see a llama on a snowy mountainside, right? And it looks like spaghetti to people, and it got a lot of laughs. But what's kind of interesting about it is that it's not like the war in Afghanistan is not this complicated. I mean, it's a complex situation. What makes people laugh at it is that it's not being distilled into any broader categories or workable concepts. It's just all the details on the table. There's no framework. And sometimes network diagrams get even more complicated than this, but that has a different function. And so what's, I guess, kind of the bigger point here is that a lot of times, your expertise and your ability to succeed in your role is on a lot of these low-level details, knowing the command line, knowing the tools, knowing exactly how to build something. But there's also what's seen as a way to earn respect and trust with your non-technical stakeholders is the ability to synthesize and describe in these sort of bigger concepts. So let's see. Yeah, and actually, being able to sort of turn down the volume on some of the things that aren't immediately about the actions can help you get to courses of action a lot faster. And in fact, one of the sort of benefits of using a tool like Puppet in your own work is that it lets you kind of turn down the volume on some of the low-level stuff, like, here are the different things I do every day, the tasks that I don't really want to think about, and kind of frees up your mind to focus on some of these bigger picture ideas. It can be actually a very fun place to explore is, what are we going to do next? And what's the vision for our department? Some of these sort of bigger, more loosey-goosey questions that people think about. And actually having someone who knows all the levels, like you folks, can be incredibly useful. And being able to communicate with everyone is what keeps these departments rolling and dissolves some of these cultural barriers that get in the way of a lot of these DevOps initiatives. And so the new role for IT departments and this sort of new future that's sort of emerging out of all these sort of automating away the low-level stuff is, there's actually a creative element, which is kind of cool. It's, well, how should we structure our environments? What kind of sort of parts do we want to build and give to people to work with? How do we get things going quickly and running? It's a bit more strategic, right? So Puppet, for example, it doesn't make those decisions for you, but it helps you codify those decisions. So once you've made them, you can kind of make them the law of the land. So you set up Puppet for your infrastructure. This takes some analysis on your part to kind of puppetize everything, and you monitor changes that are being made. You do some understanding, troubleshooting, and failure, and you write your tests. You make situations that can test resilience. These are all kind of creative activities in a way. These are more analytical. They're kind of fun, and probably some of the things that got you interested in your job. So the new role for thinking about a central IT department, or a lot of the work you do, is more about empowering business goals, making ideas happen. And this is quite similar to what Puppet Labs founder and CEO said when I think this was a keynote a little while back. What he wanted to do was build software that would let you focus on the fun things, focus on the interesting parts of the job, make those annoying, interrupty parts of the job go away, parts that make you feel like a robot, the lever pulling parts of the job. And people like you are pretty instrumental to making this happen. So when you think about like a really cool consumer application that you use, that you really love, you think it's great, it's really working for you, you hit the button, you share it with a bunch of friends, that's easy. And you hear about apps going viral. But IT tools don't go viral as fast without the users fighting for them and communicating the benefits and advocating for them and kind of spreading them. And so people like you who are here and who want to try new things are super important. I think there's a reason that these products are built for folks like you. It's because you're kind of on the leading edge of being the change agents, which comes with more than just having to implement them, but actually to evangelize them a bit. So I would love to hear from more practitioners like you. This is an interesting topic to me. I love knowing about what it is that you're working on, and in particular, the ways that you interact with your stakeholders, with your designers like me, with your product managers, business folks. I'm in Seattle. Shoot me an email, find me on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. And I will post some further reading slides for you all to check out. Any questions? Thoughts? Observations? Okay. Perfect. All right. Thank you.